Great. So thanks for the invite to speak today, yeah, thanks to Vedran for the introduction. As Vedran said, the role of University of Glasgow and myself in the project has been really to carry research alongside universities of the country. And I think what our remit for carrying out the research really was to find out what the state with I think there's really
Sorry, Andy, I think we're having some problems with your connection. So if I could just ask everybody to turn off their videos whilst Andy's presenting, and that will save us on some bandwidth. Andy, you might want to start again.
Yep. Okay, is that better? Can you understand?
Loads better. Yeah, that's loads better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious that I'm conscious of time here, and that you're probably short of time. So I'll try to sort of skip to the basic things. But what I was saying was really the importance in this project of carrying out some systematic cross-European, transcontinental work on really trying to evaluate where cities and towns were actually at in terms of the municipal transition. Because a lot of the work that's been carried out, research work that's been carried out across Europe has tended to be on case studies, either sort of comparing 2 or 3 case studies, or perhaps one good example of if you like, one of the better examples of what's going on in terms of leading cases or leading cities. And we haven't really had, up until this point anyway, any kind of systematic work that looks at the continent as a whole and tries to synthesize from different experiences across different countries what's actually happening. So that was the remit really of the research basis of this project, which we've been carrying out. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about that kind of work that's going on. Okay, just get to my, so I'm having trouble finding my slides here. I don't know why they. Is that moving through the slides if I press that button?
No, not yet. No.
No, hang on. That's better. Okay, can people see that now? Yeah.
Yes.
So just to start off with, it's worth reminding ourselves about the bigger picture of renewable energy transition, I think. And I think it's easy to lose sight of this when we're kind of really embedded in our own cases and our own work that's going on. And I think it's important to say that a lot of policy emphasis, both at the national level, at the European level, and indeed even at global level, if you think about some of the commitments that are being made at global level, there's a lot of emphasis on, or a lot of expectation that cities and towns, the local area, is the key space, if you like, for achieving a lot of the energy transition that needs to happen to combat climate change. So I think what's remarkable is that there is a lot of emphasis upon the municipal level being critical for securing the rapid energy transition. And I think we'd all agree with that at this conference today. And we'd all agree that it's really local actors that need to deliver or at least put in place the key mechanisms, the key policies to make it happen. It's been said many times, but actually, if you look at climate change and you look at the places that are responsible for emitting CO2, it's large cities in particular that responsible for most of the CO2 that gets emitted. So it's larger cities in particular that need to really make the effective transition. So the research aim, as I've said already, of mPOWER has been really to study energy transition across the continent and really to think about what the progress has been so far, but also what the barriers are. And that's been a critical element of the research that we've been doing at the University of Glasgow. And I think if there's one big take-home point from what I'm going to say today, I think what I would, it's in this quote here, that although the municipal level is very important and local municipal action is very important, it can't take place without a kind of multi-scalar context. In other words, it needs supporting institutions at regional, national, and even international level to actually allow local actors to make the changes that need to happen at the local level. And I've referenced the report there, which is one of the outcomes of the project, which we're hoping to put up online certainly in the next couple of weeks, but by the end of November at the latest, which should be accessible to all the people at this conference. Okay. So when we talk about energy transition, I think it's always recognized that Europe is a global leader. They're not without problems and continuing obstacles. But if you look at the various measures that have been looked at globally to compare how different parts of the world are doing, Europe and European countries tend to come near the top. The graphic here is from a group called the World Energy Council, which every couple of years publishes a trilemma index, which is an attempt to measure, sorry, the graphic hasn't quite come up fully, but it's an attempt to measure the three key elements of energy, energy transition, energy change. It looks at energy security, it looks at environmental sustainability, and it looks at energy efficiencies and so on. And you know, it's quite clear that the top 10 countries in this trilemma index always tend to be from either from Europe or certainly it's dominated by European countries. So Europe is leading the trend, but as I've already said, there are some continuing obstacles and blockages. And one big problem actually is the lack of availability of data, where we can actually compare what's happening at the local level across the continent. There's various issues to do with that. Much of the data that we want to access is held privately by privatized utilities or corporations. As I've already said, there's very little comparative international research on this. But I think the other interesting thing is many countries do collect local municipal data. So the UK, for example, does have quite a lot of data in its own Office of National Statistics about what's happening locally, but very little of that makes its way onto the Eurostat portal or is shared across the continent. So the mPOWER research has really been partly an element of trying to map what's happening from existing but relatively poor data. But it's also perhaps, I think there's an advocacy role here for mPOWER and other people really to push the European Union towards pushing its member states towards making the available a lot more available than it is at the moment. So what we've done so far with the mPOWER project, today I'm just going to share with you some basic findings from the survey that we carried out. But what we've done so far is we carried out a quantitative survey across Europe of 96 municipalities. We've also then undertaken 30 telephone interviews with many of the people who will be here today, took part in that process. And then we've been conducting a series of additional research visits to interesting cases that we find, and we've been trying to look at cities from different parts of the continent here to try to get a broader sense of what's happening. But that's ongoing, and I have to say that's been a little bit disrupted by the coronavirus. So we do hope to get back to some of that at some point in 2021. Our colleagues in the Basque University have also done some really valuable work trying to look at sort of how cities are moving and progressing towards energy transition with a bit of a baseline evaluation analysis, and that is written up in a paper that you'll see there on the slide, the first paper that we've highlighted. There are a couple of other papers and things in progress there. We've got a paper coming out or a chapter coming out in a book that's looking at economic policy for a post-neoliberal world. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also the summary report from our work in this phase of the mPOWER project, which should be available hopefully by the end of November at the latest, possibly earlier. So I'll just take you through in the next 5 minutes or so some key research findings I think that have come out of the survey work in particular. And I think the first thing to say is that if we look at if we do a league table of how cities and towns are doing in terms of energy transition, not surprisingly, one of the big findings is that the places that are making the greatest strides towards energy transition tend to be in the north and the western parts of Europe. Not surprisingly, those are where perhaps we've got the wealthier countries in Europe, and where perhaps there's the more advanced infrastructures, both in terms of technical, physical infrastructure, skills and knowledge, but also the capacity very often the governance capacity of municipalities to carry out the kind of transition needed. And I think one of our broad findings is that, in fact, we see the greatest progress in some of the Nordic countries, and particularly Denmark, Sweden, but also Germany. And one of the reasons for that, I think, as many of you are probably already aware, is that actually there's much more devolved local capacity and power to carry out the changes needed. But that's also matched by, and this goes back to my multi-scalar point, that's also matched by sources of funding or key supporting policies, legislation at the national level that allows municipalities really to take ownership and exercise the agency in the transition. But it's worth remarking that only 1 in 10 of the top ranked cities, municipalities in our own ranking system came from Southern Europe, and actually that was quite a small municipality. We're not talking about one of the major cities. And if we look beyond that to the Eastern European cities and regions. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I've got the 2-minute sign. It's remarkable, I think, that these Eastern European cities only begin to come into our ranking index in the kind of 20s. So, you know, that clearly is reinforcing probably something we knew already. On the positive side, I think we found that only 8 out of the 96 municipalities had no experience of renewables generation. You know, even in places that you would perhaps least expect it, there were moves in place, and there were policies, and there were the measures to shift towards renewables. If you look at the graph that we've shown, you'll see that most of the activity there tends to be in solar activity, although there was quite an interesting number of municipalities, particularly in Northern Europe, that are actually using biomass for renewables, and that's often linked to combined heat and power development. One of the things that we found was quite striking is that there wasn't much in terms of kind of advanced technology around energy efficiency and so on. Whilst municipalities can point to energy efficiency projects going on, the numbers that were involved in smart grids and so on tend to be pretty minimal, I think it's worth saying. And a lot of the activity in this area is around trying to manage public assets more efficiently, rather than perhaps broader schemes across municipalities. So I think that's one element of the project, and the findings that we found was fairly limited. If you look at why people are enacting policies for energy transition, it's not surprising that obviously carbon reduction is the main one, but actually the other kind of second, another sort of quite important motivator was the need to manage public buildings and secure infrastructure and achieve more resilience probably in the face of global warming and broader trends. We didn't find many cities kind of committed to a kind of social justice agenda, but I think that's worth saying that a lot of that, our qualitative research suggests that's not because cities and towns don't want to, but it's often because they lack the capacity or they lack the finance and so on. But we did find that over a third of the municipalities were engaged in quite interesting forms of promoting citizen engagement. I know I'm probably running out of time, so I'll skip through here. I want to talk about the key barriers. I think the main ones that we've found, and again, this probably isn't a big surprise to many people here, but I think it's important to reflect upon what's happening more broadly and learn from that. Thanks, Laura, I got that. And I think it's fair to say that most of the problems come around finance, capacity constraints, and lack of skills and knowledge, which hopefully, of course, mPOWER is kind of setting right and bringing people together and sharing knowledge and exchanging ideas. But you know, financial factors have been a big problem here, and I think we have to perhaps reflect more deeply on the impact of austerity across Europe in the last 10 years. And I guess one of the hopes is that the whole Green New Deal agenda and the reaction of many countries rather to the pandemic in terms of government spending might perhaps unblock some of the mentalities around austerity that have been really hamstringing local authorities. And our qualitative research also suggests, actually, which isn't picked up in the figure here, that actually national constraints, the lack of local autonomy, is holding many municipalities back. And even in parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, the lack of national capacities working with local but both enabling local authority, but also working with local authorities to allow transition to happen. I think the other thing I'd point to, which comes out again in our qualitative work more than the survey work, is perhaps the inappropriateness of many market-centered EU policies. The best example I can think of for that is we did a trip to Ljubljana, which is a city that was awarded green, it was awarded, sort of recognized as the green capital a few years back. And they have been very successful in applying for and getting EU funding, but a lot of the EU funding came with some pretty major constraints and drawbacks. And one of the issues that they faced in Ljubljana was that they wanted to retrofit many of their municipal buildings, but they were told that if they wanted the EU money from the European Investment Bank, they needed to use a private partner, even though there was a lack of private expertise locally in Slovenia. And rather than building up local capacity in their own municipal organizations, they felt very frustrated by having to jump through outsourcing hoops to use private partners.
Can you just wrap up a bit?
Yeah. So to conclude, I think we can say perhaps these 5 things very quickly. I think what we find is that the motivation is very strong. But I guess a question for some local authorities out with the ones that we're engaging with here is how much is driven by higher level targets rather than a genuine localized process with citizen engagement. I've mentioned the critical issue of lack of capacity, financial resources and skills as being one of the major barriers. I think we're finding that EU funding has been very important for local authorities, particularly in places where there isn't the national capacity or resources. But again, this often requires market-driven terms that aren't very appropriate, perhaps, to building up real, genuine local capacity. Divisions between North and West and South and East are very much in evidence. And I guess the other thing is really how much can best practice in some very well-resourced parts of Europe be transferred to places that have less resources and capacities. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview to take forward into the next couple of days of where we're at the broader continental level. And thanks again for inviting me to speak and being here for the conference today. Thank you.